Okay, so moving on to section 8.3, inferring brain maturation from behavior. There's a number of different types of behavior that we can connect the sort of behavioral and cognitive development of kids onto what we know about the brain developing during that time. So motor behavior is one of the first things that you observe in babies. There are all these milestones that parents are often obsessed with. There's something that we observe called motor babbling, which is random or spontaneous hand and finger movements that actually consist in sort of snippets of movements that the baby's going to later use in skilled fine motor control. And it's believed to be a way to practice hand movements. So they kind of practice these little hand movements, but in a non-purposeful way. And this typically happens between months 1 to 3. By 4 months, babies can typically grasp objects in a more goal-oriented manner, although rather crudely and not in a very dexterous manner. By 10 months, they can use the famous pincer grip with their thumb and their index finger. So if you see parents giving their babies Cheerios or putting just like loose peas or something like that on their plate, the parents might be helping their kid practice their pincer grip, which is this ability to grab an object with the index finger and the thumb, and that's considered a pretty significant motor milestone. Increased fine motor control, so like the pincer grip, corresponds with the myelination of the motor cortex axons. So before I mentioned that myelination is kind of the last thing that happens in terms of maturation of or the gross maturation of a part of the brain. And so once an area is myelinated, the kid is able to do that activity to some degree. Interestingly, the increase in fine motor control is actually associated with the thinning of cortical areas that are associated with motor control. This might seem confusing because we've talked in the past about thickening of the cortex being associated with better functioning in those areas. The thicker the cortex, often the higher intelligence, things like this. But thinning is actually sometimes associated with increased efficiency of neuronal processes in young brains, possibly in part to synaptic pruning that has created increased efficiency of the connections between neurons. And also myelination increases the white matter, which decreases by proportion the gray matter. Okay, so language development. Children reach language milestones in a pretty fixed order, and this is across all different languages and cultures. At around 10 months, most kids are babbling. So this is like motor babbling, but this is with language. So in language, babbling is speech sounds that are contained in that native language, but are not real words. And certainly everyone has heard this. Kids just kind of speaking nonsense, babies saying syllables, da, 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 ba, 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 things like this. They're actually practicing the building blocks of language. And this will turn into their developing the motor skills and also trying to connect what they hear to what they're producing. So babbling is extremely important in kids. At around 12 months, they might be saying a couple words, 5 to 10 words. And there's a large increase in neuronal connectivity in Broca's area, which is this speech motor area between 15 to 24 months. Around 12 months, the vocabulary has risen to 200 to 300 words quite considerably. Cell division and migration is happening in language areas. It's mostly complete in language areas. There's increased connectivity and axonal myelination in those areas as well. Around 3 years, the vocab is rather large, 1,000 words. They're speaking in simple sentences. They can communicate rather effectively for the most part. Language acquisition is mostly complete by age 12. Of course, vocabulary is going to increase, etc., but they're speaking mostly like a basic adult. And notably, muscles that are required for coordinated speech develop before speech emerges. So babbling is probably part of the reason for that. They're practicing these muscles and these motor actions that are needed for speech. Notably, not all kids meet these rough milestones at the same time, so language is sometimes rather delayed in kids who later turn out to have perfectly normal language abilities. It's not always clear why that is, but that can be rather stressful for parents, and it's just worth noting that it doesn't always mean the kid is going to have autism or some other kind of language issue. It's just sometimes brains develop differently in kids. So language is associated with, or increased language processing is associated with a thickening, in this case, of the left inferior frontal cortex. So this is around that Broca's area that we were talking about before. There is a critical period for language. So again, a critical period is a time during which a skill must be developed, or it may not be able to, after this critical period, it may not be possible for an individual to develop that skill, at least at the level of their cohorts. So roughly between 5 years and puberty, it's believed that a kid must be exposed to language and at least start to learn language, or they may never develop fully fluent language. There's a very famous case that you might have seen in an earlier psychology class if you've taken other psychology classes. This girl, Jeannie, who was very severely neglected and abused and was not exposed to language early in her life. She was kind of brought in by these researchers, and they tried to teach her language, but she never was able to fully develop language. And if you'd like, there's a link to a really quick documentary on this girl. Notably, this is, of course, a case study. There have been other case studies that have found similar effects. It's obviously something that we can't do experimental work on. It would be extremely unethical to deprive kids of language and see what happens, but there have been enough individual cases of this that it does seem to be ring true that kids must be exposed to language previous to puberty. In terms of problem-solving abilities, people may have heard of Piaget, who had stages of cognitive development. I'm not going to go into the individual stages very much. That's more of a developmental psychology, more of what you would learn in developmental psychology class. But roughly, there's these 4 general stages: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. And Piaget believed that kids sort of had these spurts of cognitive development. So they would be able to do a certain amount of things in this stage and couldn't do any of the skills from later in the stage. And this has been a little bit not everyone completely agrees with all the stages and everything that Piaget said, but it does map on fairly well to what we know about growth spurts in the brain. So during these approximate typical age ranges of the stages, there are also these growth spurts in the brain, and in both the body and in the brain with increased neurons. So growth spurts, probably familiar with this term, they're sporadic and finite periods of sudden growth. This goes along with the principle that the brain and body do not grow uniformly. It's not a nice, even growth line. It's comes and goes in spurts. So roughly 3 to 10 months, there's kind of a growth spurt, and then growth might level off for a little while. 2 to 4 years, you see another spurt of growth that might level off, so etc. for 6 to 10, 10 to 12, and 14 to 16. During these times, brain weight can increase by as much as 5 to 10%, which is quite a large amount. And this brain weight is accounted for by increase in synapses, neurons getting bigger, new astrocytes being created to support the neuronal growth, and then increases in the myelination. So one way that we can observe this sort of these phases or stages of development is that children don't always seem to learn the simplest tasks first. Sometimes they seem to have gained more complex skills at an earlier age. And this might be in part to different brain areas developing, not the simplest ones first, for example. So there are these three tasks that these experimenters did. The first was a displacement task, where food is earned when a specific object is displaced or moved. So in the picture, you can see they did this task with both monkeys and with kids. I'll talk about the one with the kids. So if they displace the little purple pyramid, then they get a food reward. The next is the non-matching to sample task, where a novel object can be displaced for a reward. So regardless of what the new object is, they're shown two objects, and regardless of what the new object is, if that one is moved or displaced, then they always get rewarded for that one. So the child learns that just always move the new object and you get the reward. They can do this task around 18 months, and it's believed to be dependent on temporal lobe functioning. So the next task is the concurrent discrimination learning task, and this is like a trial and error learning task where the kid discovers that certain objects are always associated with reward. So it's not that novel objects are associated with reward, it's that, for example, within pair 1, on day 1, day 2, etc., the green box is always going to be associated with the food reward, and then on the second pair, this yellow L is always going to be associated with the food reward, etc. And this task is believed to be dependent on basal ganglia functioning. And children can do this task around 12 months, which is surprising because it seems like a more difficult task. The child has to remember which objects are always associated with the food reward. It seems like it would be easier that the kid just has to remember to displace the new object, as in the non-matching to sample task. And it's believed that kids can do this kind of more complex concurrent discrimination learning task at an earlier age because basal ganglia functioning might develop, the basal ganglia as a structure might develop more quickly than the temporal lobe, making it possible to do this more challenging task before the seemingly easier task.